So John Cockburn and Mark Silcock mark an important moment in game console history. And they do this when they point out the fact that the Nintendo Wii outsold the Xbox 360, even though the Xbox 360 was predicted to do better by analysts. In 2006, Nintendo was to release its Wii gaming console. In that same year, Microsoft was also to release the Xbox 360 and Sony was to release the PlayStation 3. At the time, analysts did not think much of the Wii given its primitive graphics and childish content. However, the Wii significantly outperformed both other consoles. Cockburn and Silcock attribute the sales performance of the Wii to its prioritization on kinesthetics rather than its sensory manifold. So, the kinesthetic manifold of a gaming console refers to the controls used to manipulate its environment. Typically, these are gamepads with various buttons and joysticks, and prior to the Wii's release, not a whole lot of thought by developers was put into these surfaces. Rather, companies focused on the game's sensory manifold, which included the sounds output from the game's visual effects, images, graphics, and the like. And so, assuming that what makes a video game enterprise like Star Citizen or any other video game enterprise successful is its representation of reality. An important question in this context, game development is what counts as real. And for this, we need a theory of realism, and that's what brings us back to this difference between kinesthetic manifolds versus sensory ones. So why this is important is because one prevailing view about what makes a successful game enterprise is the way that the game accurately represents the way things are, and that what the consumers of video games want above all else are games that accurately reflect reality. And so game development prioritizing kinesthetics outsells a console with superior graphics. And so why is this important? Well, philosophically speaking, this is a question that is known as realism versus anti-realism debate. And there are two competing versions of this debate. So on one hand, philosophers and developers and the like might call themselves phenomenalists. And so what a phenomenalist is and here's a direct quote: people do not directly perceive the actual world. Or what a phenomenalist believes is that people do not, and here's a quote, directly perceive the actual world, but instead experience a realm that is a function of their own private sensory manifolds. On the other hand, you have an activist, and what an activist thinks is that direct perception is a function of the way we physically manipulate ourselves in our environment, and that's a direct quote as well. And so what that means is that direct perception is a function of the way we engage our environments and the way we express our agency in that environment. And so there are different treatments of this question, and both which span across various philosophical subdisciplines. And so quickly, these would include, but they're not limited to, of course, philosophy of science and metaphysics, epistemology, and value theory, to name a few. But there, of course, are many different versions of the question, depending on the relevant philosophical subdiscipline. For instance, in value theory, ergo ethics, we might ask whether moral judgments accurately reflect the way things are. For instance, when stating a moral value judgment, do we say something true about the real world? Do these judgments track truth of the real world, or track truths that we might find in the real world, etc.? But we are not here to talk about the existence of moral truths that our judgments may or may not track, not directly anyway, but rather we are here to talk about what it means to represent reality. And the right answer here ought to tell us what will make a given video game successful, I guess, at least according to Cockburn et al. It should. So first, one particular question that the realism and anti-realism debate tracks is what is known as the question of the external world. And those who are familiar with philosophical debates might think that this is a metaphysical question. However, the way I will approach it here, and the way I believe that Cockburn et al. Approach it, is epistemically. Therefore, the question that we are asking is, how do we experience our environment? How do we come to have knowledge about our environment, or knowledge how do we discover true facts about our environment? And so the correct theory about how we experience our environment will tell game developers how developers how they should represent our environment. And so for our purposes here, we will only look at two views, the inactivist view and the phenomenalist view, but there are many others, but we're not going to look at those right now. And so according to phenomenalist theories, we do not directly perceive our environments. Rather, we have various sensory experiences, and from these, we infer various facts about our environment. For instance, Bertrand Russell, in his book Problems with Philosophy, gives an example of this view. He says, to the eye is oblong, well, speaking about a table, he says, to the eye it is oblong, brown, and shiny, and to the touch it is smooth and cool and hard, and when I tap it, it gives out a wooden sound. Anyone else who sees and feels and hears the table will agree with this description, so that it might seem that no difficulty would arise. And so let's look more closely at Bertrand's phenomenalist view, which is a precursor to our modern phenomenalist views. You might say one of the seminal expressions of this view. And so in his Problems in Philosophy, so one of the things that he's going to argue is that we only perceive sense data. These are things that are immediately known to the senses, and they include colors, sounds, smells, hardness, and roughness. And you notice that actual objects are not in the list. Rather, properties of objects are what make it onto Russell's list. And so, if only direct to the senses, why should game developers focus on photorealism? Well, accordingly, we only perceive the sense data itself. And so these are, like I said, colors and sounds, smells, hardness, roughness, textures, temperatures, so on and so forth. And so you would have to look at our senses, and you would have to look at each of our senses, and we don't have any senses that look at objects. Our senses only look at, our faculties only look at properties of objects, but not the objects themselves. And so I keep coming back to this topic of phenomenalism, but more importantly, in this series, I'm only looking at the video game Star Citizen. And even though Cogburn and Al are looking at game station consoles and at various game enterprises that are hosted on those consoles, I think it's important to look at Star Citizen and other PC games that involve people who spend a lot of their waking time thinking about the game, writing about the game, building websites about the game, and so on. And so that's what I do here. So ultimately, what I'd like to do is look at the game Star Citizen, because I think it involves a lot of pretty hardcore gamers, a group of people I myself do not belong to, just in case anyone gets the wrong idea that I'm trying to present myself as someone that I'm not. But I think it's interesting. So in this video, I just kind of introduced the problem, but in the next video, I'll talk a little bit more about Star Citizen and how I think it might change this current conversation. So anyway, tune in next time, and hope to see you then. Bye.